Hello and welcome to the Montana Passenger Rail Summit. My name is Justin Angle and I'll be your host or conductor for our time together today. I'm a professor at the University of Montana College of Business, and it's been great learning more about the benefits of passenger rail in the lead up to this event. So our first panel today will feature a discussion assessing the state of passenger rail in America. But before we turn to our panelists, let's hear from some community leaders across Montana on why they are so bullish about passenger rail. This short film is titled Back on Track and was produced by Tom Aldrich with photographic support from Justin France. Take it away.
Well, it was in 1883 that the Northern Pacific Railroad came through the southern tier of Montana and right through Missoula County. We lost passenger rail service through southern Montana in 1979, and for the past 41 years, we've been trying to get it back. In the year 2020, we are embracing passenger rail as a way to bring this state, this region, and this nation back together again. We're doing something that has never been done before in the state of Montana, and that is knitting the state together from Idaho all the way to North Dakota, with counties initiating an effort to establish a regional rail authority, the Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority.
Communities would greatly benefit from additional transportation options, such as passenger rail. This safe, affordable, and reliable option would provide the connectivity throughout the region, as well as alleviate some of the weather and traffic concerns. Restoring passenger rail is long overdue. While the northern tier of the great state of Montana is covered, the central and southern tiers aren't. And so anything we can do to increase that would be great.
The rail came through Livingston en route to Yellowstone Park in 1883. Teddy Roosevelt, there's an iconic photo of him right here on the back of a Pullman car waving, a classic Teddy pose in 1903. And then he headed down to Gardner and dedicated the arch that year. I came out here for a summer job in 1972. My fourth summer, I rode the train. Rail travel is efficient, economical, and enjoyable.
This is something the community misses. This is something tourists miss. This is a historical site. This site you before is historical. A lot of people want to be back here looking at the train. The train was part of the history of this part of Helena, and bringing it back, bringing development back to this part of Helena, the 6th Ward, can be better. It's ideal. You know, I think this is a great idea. I think it will boost our economy. I think it will help alleviate some of the inequality that we have here. We will be able to travel freely during the winter months. And so I thank you guys for what you're trying to do. I really do.
Intercity travel and regional travel once was by train. The economy evolved, industry evolved, but I think not to try to go back to an age we can never turn back the clock. It's impossible, but we can learn from innovation technology and realize that there are ways to do old things better now, and optimizing travel between Billings and Missoula and Kalispell and Bozeman is going to be a critical deliverable for us to progress our economy in the next 20 to 30 years. And the best way to do that interconnectivity, I think, is through rail.
Okay, time for the panel. We have three amazing voices on this topic. We have John Robert Smith, who's the co-chair and senior policy advisor, Transportation for America. Beth Osborne, who's the director at Transportation for America. And Jim Mathews, president and CEO of the Rail Passengers Association. Jim, let's start with you.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I wish I was in Montana. I've made several trips out there to speak to some of the folks, and I really do enjoy it. I think the film did a really wonderful job of laying out what the benefits of rail travel are. I mean, clearly, a lot of us will get kind of tied up in the emotional or the nostalgic piece of it, and that's a real thing. But at the same time, it is a practical transportation option, particularly for rural America. And one of the things that I hope we're going to be able to do over the next few hours as a group is to get at this idea that we hear all the time. When you start talking about passenger rail service, it always becomes a conversation about, well, how are you going to pay for that? And is it going to make money? No one asks whether our highways make money. No one asks if the National Weather Service makes money. Nobody asks if the Air Force makes money. But when you start talking about passenger rail, everybody wants to know if the train is going to make a profit. And I think if we can start to assess the benefits of rail to the community and start to view this as the investment that it actually is, and to start to see the returns that come to the communities as the taxpayers' return on equity or return on investment, I think we can change the conversation, and I hope that's really what we're able to do today as a group. This comes from an Amtrak timetable from not all that long ago, where Amtrak really embraced the idea that rail is the economic engine of the heartland. And everyone who talks about Amtrak as a money loser, long distance routes as being money losing long distance routes, it's like a Homeric epithet, like swift-footed Achilles. That's not really the case. Small towns collect that profit rather than Amtrak, and Amtrak itself acknowledged that. This is an ad from not too long ago. This was in Meridian, Mississippi, and my friend John Robert Smith is on the panel with us. And he, I'm sure, can talk more about that. But this points out that the fact that we have this network operating these trains and depositing people all over the country contributes $7.4 billion to the economy. And you see the waiters there at the restaurant in Meridian at Weidman's, very well-known place. And that is what we need to be thinking about. Why do we want to do passenger rail? It's not about an individual route making a profit for Amtrak. It's about the service that's delivered to the taxpayers for the investment of taxpayer money. We're having this conversation about Montana, so I wanted to share just a little bit of information about what the builder does for Montana right now. And last year, we looked at the direct effects of the builder, the employment, and so forth. But we also looked at induced effects and indirect effects. And so you see $5.4 million and 25 additional jobs come from just goods and services bought, as well as the Amtrak employees that are there working or that pass through the state. In-state purchases by Amtrak, all those kinds of things. Very direct, very sort of obvious kinds of things. So even if you look at just those obvious measures, the fact that we have an empire builder running through Montana is generating millions of dollars for Montana. But then this is the slide that I'd like you to think about as well. You have induced visitors. Just one little piece of this that folks don't necessarily think about when we talk about passenger rail. When people get on and off the train, they shop, they stay places, they stay at an Airbnb or a hotel, they pay for recreation, they hit the trails, they eat in restaurants, they go to bars. So they pay sales taxes in those transactions. And employees of those establishments work there in part because of the traffic generated by the train. All of those things add up as well. So that's another $3.4 million that we can show in Montana just from that kind of thing. This is from our analysis at Rail Passengers Association. And one of the reasons we're working so hard on this is because, as you know, Amtrak is planning, as one of its responses to the coronavirus crisis, to cut long distance service from daily to 3 times a week. And we have assessed that right now, the Empire Builder contributes about $595 million to the nation's economy. And all of the 12 trains that are daily today that will become 3 times a week trains together contribute about $4.77 billion a year. If you cut that to 3 times a week, the builder's going to be contributing $204 million. That means that the communities served by the Empire Builder will lose $293 million worth of value in the 9 months that Amtrak expects to be running at 3 times a week instead of daily. That turns out to be closer to $400 million if we wind up having to go more than 9 months. So the reason I point that out is for 2 things. One, it's important to recognize the value that these trains bring and continue to bring and could bring to southern and central Montana if we were to get new service, but also to recognize how important it is to support the service that we have now and how important that is to Montanans. So all of that speaks to the value of trains to the communities and to the taxpayers and to the residents. So let's try real hard not to focus on whether a train makes money and instead think about who the train makes money for. And that's really all I had to say. And I look forward to the conversation.
So Jim, I want to thank you for your leadership at RPA and for the working relationship we've had over the past several years. And I'm so pleased to join all of you this morning. I have fought for passenger rail in this country for more than 30 years now. And the most important thing I have learned is that when you're speaking to the value and the vision of passenger rail, it's the messenger that matters most in that discussion. And for those of you in the big sky passenger rail conversation, whether it's preserving the Empire Builder or restoring service through the southern part of your state, you are those messengers that matter most. In my first term in office, I served 16 years as the mayor of my hometown, Meridian, Mississippi. And during my first term, we built the South's first multimodal transportation center, which you see here on the screen before you. And it was an economic development project as much as a transportation project. But midway through construction of this building, Amtrak decided to cut service to long distance trains all across the country, which means I would lose service to my hometown because they were going to cut the crescent off at Atlanta. But it was the mayors we organized across the country that came to Capitol Hill and turned Senator Trent Lott from Mississippi and Senator Kay Bailey Hutchison from Texas and others into passionate champions for the long distance system. And we were able to save most of the long distance routes and turn them back into daily service. And that's how I first got to know about Whitefish, Montana, and Avon, because I was taking the Empire Builder to visit those mayors in those hometowns. Now, don't be drawn into the false choice that it is either preserving the Empire Builder or restoring new service back along the southern part of your state. Because when I was chairman of the board of Amtrak, and we had a lot less money to work with, as Jim and Beth both know at that time, we rolled out Acela, the high-speed rail service in this country for the first time. We not only sustained the long-distance system, we improved it, and those of you who are riding the Empire Builder at that time know that to be true, but we also expanded service in what has been now known as state-supported trains. As a region, though, it's not enough to be passionate advocates. You need to be advocates with power, and that's congressional authority. And I want to speak about the Southern Rail Commission, for whom we provide policy advice. The Southern Rail Commission, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, not only work to preserve the 3 long-distance trains that serve them, but to institute new service, the first of its kind in over 70 years in the South, between New Orleans and Mobile. But to do this, they had to have national impact. And these are the products of the Southern Rail Commission's work on Capitol Hill. The fact that rail is in the FAST Act with highways and transit for the first time in the history of the country is due in large measure to the work of the Southern Rail Commission, working with Senator Roger Wicker from Mississippi and Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey. And within that program, we created 2 funding streams, the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvements. That's how you're going to provide the capital needed for sidings and crossings in your new service. And also the Restoration and Enhancement Grant, which provides matching funds for operating support of the first 3 years of your new service. But critically important to you is within the FAST Act, it was created a Gulf Coast working group that compelled the FRA and Amtrak and CSX to come to the table and define what would restoration of service look like, what would be the schedule, how much would it cost, and how do we pay for it. And I think that's a good model for you moving forward with the Big Sky Commission. Now, the reason that the Southern Rail Commission has been so successful is because they made their case based on a return on investment. And for the new service between New Orleans and Mobile, the return on investment is 15 to 1, $15 for every $1 invested by those 3 states. And the reason you have that kind of impact is because the new service connects to 3 existing long distance trains. You see, the long distance trains and the new service not only strengthen each other in ridership and revenue, importantly, they strengthen their voice on Capitol Hill. And that is why the Southern Rail Commission's voice is heard by people in power and people in decision-making authority. Now, I've known Beth Osborne, our next panelist, since I was working Capitol Hill on behalf of Amtrak, and she was a staffer to Senator Tom Carper from Delaware. And Beth has not only remained a close friend over those years, she is now also my colleague at Transportation for America and leads our national work. Beth, give us an idea of what you see moving nationally at this time, and most importantly, what do you see as opportunities at this time?
Absolutely. The strange time we find ourselves in has produced a new opportunity to discuss the things we need with regard to infrastructure. There are 2 big opportunities coming up that are real opportunities for rail. One is in early 2021, I do expect that there's going to be some kind of stimulus package. I think that that's likely no matter who wins the election, because when you start out a term, you want to start out with a bang, and we will be, nearly a year into an economic slump that no matter who is in power is going to want to pull us out of. So a stimulus package is a great opportunity to talk about rail needs, and every other booster for every other kind of infrastructure investment area is going to be talking about their needs. Additionally, as part of our regular process, our existing surface transportation program expires on the 30th of this month. We normally authorize our transit, rail, and highway programs over a 5-year period of time. And so the 5 years ends this month. We are not going to have a bill ready to replace the current program by the expiration date. So I expect Congress will extend it likely for a year to give the new Congress a chance to tackle the issue. And as John Robert pointed out, with the leadership of groups like the Southern Rail Commission and our own work, we've been able to really elevate the need and the great benefits of rail investment across the country. And so in the last reauthorization bill, the last surface transportation bill, we added significant funds for rail programs and for new rail service, which the Southern Rail Commission is taking advantage of to restart the service along the Gulf Coast that was ended after Hurricane Katrina. We definitely need to make sure that those programs are preserved in the new bill, but it's also an opportunity to expand and build on them and maybe seek the same budgetary protections for rail funding that we currently have for transit and highway funding. I'd like to say that while the messages are important, the messengers matter most. The most powerful messages, just like John Roberts said, are those on Capitol Hill. And while I believe coalitions like ours are extremely important, the power of our coalition is being able to get our members and our coalition partners to speak up with the same voice at the right time, but they're the right messengers to go to Capitol Hill. When I was on Capitol Hill working for Tom Carper from Delaware, and he, like his senior senator at the time, Joe Biden, were known for riding the train into DC every year, Senator Carper would come off the train with a list from his interactions with people from his district who caught him on the train. That was always challenging for a staffer. But when a Delawarean stopped him on the street and said, "I have this issue," he took it very, very seriously, and it came straight to me. A message from a coalition like mine did not get the same attention. So while we can certainly be helpful and we can supply information, you are your best messenger, and your representatives want to hear from you. And then the last thing I want to say, also building off of what John Roberts said, is more service strengthens the case for existing service. The time when Amtrak had its least support on Capitol Hill was when it was ending service and decreasing service across the country. And it communicated to members of Congress that it was a dying and irrelevant service. That is the biggest threat to lines like the Empire Builder. It's in fact how transit was destroyed across a lot of the country. What happened was the operator would cut service, and then the predictable drop in ridership was proof that it didn't have the same demand it used to. So you cut service more, you drop ridership, and you then drop service more until there's so few riders, you say, see, nobody likes it. We don't want to see rail service stagnate in this country. When you have more people exposed to it, enjoying it, communities getting to build an economy around it, seeing the great economic boost that comes from it, that shows people that this is something that's really exciting, that it has promise across the country, and that's what's going to do the most to keep existing service not just alive, but in really good condition, and the trains replaced and in top service condition as well. So I think this conversation you're having here today is not only really exciting and important for folks that don't currently have service, but will do only the best work to strengthen the service for those who do have a rail in their communities today. And at that point, I'll hand things back off because I believe we have opportunity for question and answer.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And thanks to all the panelists. We've had some excellent questions coming in, and I'll sort of try to surface as many of those as possible. Keep them coming in from the audience. One question that has sort of come up a couple of times that I've seen is a question about how these sort of interstate coalitions or authorities come together and what their role is. I mean, it's one thing for Montana to be excited about restoring passenger rail, but if our neighbors to various sides of the state are not on board, that's a different proposition. How do these interstate coalitions come together and function and try to advance these projects?
Well, Justin, I'll take that one. The Southern Rail Commission was authorized by an act of Congress. It's unique in its ability, and that congressional authorization gives it the power to reach across state boundaries. So that's why you have Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama focused on that region, but we can also include Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas. We have that ability to reach out to those and are doing so now. And of course, your vision for connectivity in your region really can't be just within the borders of Montana. It needs to reach to your neighboring states because you are a part of a region that can have a very successful economic future. So having that congressional authority not only allows you to reach across those boundaries, it also gives you the authority to apply directly for federal funds through grants. In the good old days of earmarks, the SRC could get individual earmarks. While it is important to have the support of our DOT commissioners, and they are a part of the SRC commission, if you have a governor that rotates out and decides rail isn't their priority, it doesn't matter. The Southern Rail Commission keeps on moving and has done so in restoration of service now for 15 years, and they're actually beginning their first capital project by the January of this coming year.
Super. A couple questions coming in about trade-offs for communities. One of our attendees is interested in sort of how you would weigh trade-offs of investments in rail versus investments in intercity bus infrastructure, for example. How do you even approach questions like that?
So I'd like to take that, but I'd also like to maybe hand that off when I'm finished to Beth, because I know this is in her wheelhouse as well. There's a couple of things. Some are obvious, some are not so obvious. First of all, Rail Passengers Association, we do actually support the idea of buses as extenders to the national network. We're not just all rail all the time. But that said, one of the things that you have to look at with buses is capacity. It takes a lot more buses to carry the number of folks you're going to carry on a train. There is the whole sort of fuel efficiency per passenger issue as well. Trains can go in weather that buses can't. The roads are just statistically more dangerous than traveling by rail. So all of those things are I think, fairly obvious, and they factor into your thinking about the role of buses versus trains. But then there's also a larger sort of, it's almost a psychological component that we find that when you have something that is infrastructure heavy, like a train station, that capital ties the investment and keeps the community invested in it. I can stop bus service as simply as just saying, well, we're just not going to run the service anymore. And other than maybe a bus stop, there's nothing there to tie it to the community. It's a lot easier to start a bus service. It's also a lot easier to kill it. And when you put those in infrastructure investments in place in rail, that it's a signal to the business community. It's a signal to the community at large that we're here to stay, we're here for the long term, and we want to build and grow. And I think that's something that certainly you see that when you start looking at transit-oriented development, that psychology does play a role in the longevity of the service.
I don't actually have a lot to add to what Jim said. I think he laid things out very well. People find the bus very attractive because of its flexibility, but its flexibility comes with some downsides as well, particularly when it comes to intercity bus service. It's generally less under the control of public officials that are seeking to provide a public service to their community. But I think the goal is to have as many options as possible for your constituents. And I don't think we'd ever argue whether or not we should have rail or highways. It's really only in the non-highway modes we start to say, well, you only get one. And really, if there's four, you should get all four. And we should be seeking to give our communities as many options to get around as possible. In areas that have really good opportunities to move around, they have all. And so I think the best possible outcome is to have good intercity bus service and good intercity rail service. And often, I mean, you certainly find it on a local level, those areas that have great trains in terms of transit tend to have better bus ridership too. It tends to pull choice riders onto the bus in a way that bus only service doesn't. In places that have good rail service, intercity rail service, you tend to have really good intercity bus service too. So the two kind of play into each other. And I don't like the idea that you would pick one off of the other. I really think providing people with good options is the goal.
Sure.
And I'd just like to add that Amtrak has a bus that travels from Dallas-Fort Worth across northern Louisiana to Meridian, Mississippi, so that you can either join the city of New Orleans to go to Chicago at Jackson, or join the Crescent Meridian to go north to Washington, D.C. and New York. And Amtrak sees that as a benefit. And in the study along the Gulf service, their bus routes plan to Pensacola, Florida, out of Mobile, to Montgomery, and then on to Birmingham, focusing into Mobile, and also connections out of New Orleans to Baton Rouge and other cities to draw in the entire region to that route that right now will serve two principal cities along the Mississippi Gulf.
So we're getting so Jim, in your remarks, you painted sort of some of the higher level economic numbers and sort of made the case with data. I want to pivot to kind of stories of how establishing rail or reestablishing passenger rail has affected economic development in terms of business development or housing in particular. We get a lot of questions about housing, and particularly affordable housing. How has this positively changed communities where this service has been established or reestablished?
Well, again, I'm happy to take that, but I think both John Robert and Beth have at least as much expertise and maybe more, and certainly in Meridian, we've been able to see up close the direct effects and direct benefits to the community, and what that's done for improving people's quality of life. But certainly what we've seen when we look around the country is what access does, right? So it's a question of being able to move workers to and from opportunities, and making it possible for someone to work in one place, live in another. And I'm not just talking about sort of the Northeast commuter type model either. I'm talking about being able to get folks in rural communities access to economic opportunities. And we've seen that actually across the northern part of the country, with workers going back and forth using the Empire Builder almost as a kind of commuter service. So what you're doing is you're extending the economies geographically. You're making it possible for someone to earn money in one place and spend it in another. And that can improve access to housing, access to medical care, because you're kind of bringing in an economic opportunity that might not otherwise be there. And we see that, again, we see it in the large scale, but we also see it in little places all over the country. But John Robert, I mean,
Sure.
I'll add real quick that transportation is generally the second largest cost to the household after housing costs. And for very low income people, it often jumps above housing costs. Yes. So, finding ways for people to afford to get around without necessarily having to own and operate a car for every person over 16 years of age in their household is a very important tool to improve access. We do find that where rail service is available, the demand for that service is so high, we see property values increase. And frankly, If you're making an investment and it does nothing to improve the values around that investment, that was probably a pretty poor investment to begin with. We consistently see that where rail service is added or improved, we see increases in value. It's super important we make sure that those who are low income have access to that service. And it often takes real forethought before the investment, because once the momentum and the excitement around the area starts, it's hard to build it in. What I think is really important is to put that in front, not view that as an inevitable outcome.
So I'll just give you a few answers about Meridian. After we built our center in Meridian, which you've seen the quality of the place, property values quadrupled in the downtown. Sales tax revenue increased 60%. The return on investment to the city was $100 for every $1 we invested in that facility. You now have condominiums and apartments in the downtown. You have a vibrant after five life in the downtown, in which there was none beforehand. And you see a restored opera house with entertainment coming from the Kennedy Center down in Washington, D.C. to Meridian to perform. And you see the art and entertainment experience showcasing Mississippi artists. And a lot of people come by rail from New Orleans and Hattiesburg and up to Birmingham to enjoy these amenities within the downtown. But it's not just Meridian. Look what has happened in Denver, Colorado, with their downtown station, totally lifted what had been a dead part of Denver. And the Denver City Council was considering demolishing the historic structure. Also look at Normal, Illinois. It's a new building built that, and look what Normal has done to create a vibrant downtown center. We see it all over the country.
So what do we know about how COVID-19 has affected ridership? You see a lot in the media about how it's affected air travel. Any evidence on how it's affecting rail travel?
I'd like to start with that, if I can. So we've seen across the board transportation ridership decline, right? We see it in air, we see it in rail, we see it everywhere. But if you look at the long distance trains that Amtrak runs, the ridership there held up more than it did on the state supported routes and on the Northeast Corridor. And that's kind of, that makes sense when you look at it, right? That you didn't necessarily have folks jumping on the train to go from office to office, but for those in rural America or along the long distance routes, it really does mark itself out as essential transportation. We saw declines only around 60 some odd percent or thereabouts, depending on which route, on the long distance trains versus 90% on the Northeast Corridor, and those kinds of numbers. It's all starting to recover a little bit, but the long distance trains really did decline less because those trips were much more essential. And what we're seeing now is Amtrak has limited the capacity of the trains to keep them safe in the coronavirus era. They've limited bookings to 50% of the capacity of the train for social distancing and that sort of thing. So bearing that 50% in mind, we're seeing now on some long distance routes, they're coming close to selling out the train. In other words, selling out up to that 50% limit. So we're seeing that people do want to take the train when it's there because people do still need to travel and want to travel. And so the issue really just becomes making sure that it can be done safely. And then once you've taken those steps, we need to be able to prove that it's safe. We need to be able to demonstrate to people that yes, there are air filtration systems in place. Yes, the number of air changes per hour does exceed the standard. When you can do that, I think that we'll start to see the demand start to recover because we're already starting to see it recover somewhat now. Is it where it needs to be? Of course not. It's still dramatically lower than it was in say, February. But it is gradually inching back.
And long distance trains are perceived as being a much safer way to travel, certainly than air today or bus today. And to put a fine point in what Jim said, keep in mind that the long distance trains today provide more revenue to Amtrak than the Northeast Corridor or the state-supported trains combined. And last week, the long-distance trains, Jim, were only down 48%.
That's
so in
right.
effect, they're running fully sold out and are providing between 55 and 60% of the revenue. So why would you take your biggest producer of revenue and slash it by 60% by going to 3 days a week? That doesn't seem to make business sense to me.
Justin, I'm going to answer the question from a much broader angle than the whole just rail. Travel is down. People have been told to stay home. They're not taking vacations the way they would have. They are not traveling across state lines as much as they used to. The commute trip has nearly evaporated. Even as we've seen driving increase, it's not been the commute trip, which was actually only 20% of trips, even though it's nearly 100% of our focus in transportation planning. It has definitely changed the way we move around. The real question is, will the way we move around be permanently changed? And I don't think in the long run, people are going to stop all long distance trips. They're never going to take vacations again because COVID existed at one time in our lives. So I think that interstate travel is going to restart at some point, and in some way, and rail service should be part of those options. I can do a whole seminar about what's going on locally, which is a much more interesting and difficult to predict sort of future. All I can tell you is anyone who tells you nothing will change, it should be dismissed, and anyone who tells you everything will change should be dismissed. In terms of local travel, what I will promise you is it will change. I don't know how, and it will be between nothing and everything changing.
And at the risk of prolonging this, can I just add on to something that Beth mentioned?
Sure.
I think it's really important. One of the things we've been looking at in the past couple of months to sort of study the issue is the travel behavior and the likelihood of return. And a lot of people have, to Beth's point, started declaring that no one's going to travel anymore. We're all going to do just like we are right here today, all of us staring at a screen. And that is just an unrealistic assessment. As Beth says, people will travel, people will move, and they'll move for lots of reasons. One thing that people say is, oh, well, everyone will just start working online. Well, only 38% of America's workforce would be considered knowledge workers and able to work online. A lot of other people have to go somewhere to do their job. That's not going to just vanish. The idea that you could take call centers and remote work and put them out in America's heartland, and that way we'll just all work from home and everyone will just turn their living room into a call center. Well, when you look at the penetration of rural broadband, that turns out not to be a practical option. And then there's also the human connection, right? That people just want to travel. People want to interact with other people. And you see it really in I would call it a little bit of a negative. You see that when Memorial Day happened and people started running out to the bars and getting closer to people when they shouldn't. But that reckless behavior points to a psychological truth that whether it's for leisure or in the workforce, we're fundamentally a social species, and we want to interact with other humans. And the form that takes in the next year or two or three, I think, like Beth says, who knows? It's not going to be exactly the way it was. But the idea that we're all going to hide in our homes for the next 20 or 30 years, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, certainly look forward to a world that gets somewhat back to what it used to be like. Time to thank our panelists. That's all the time we have. A lot of questions coming in from the audience. Great questions about some of the specifics of what's being proposed for passenger rail in southern Montana. We'll get to those questions as we go. Keep the questions coming. And before we go to break, two things. We're going to throw up a poll question for you and have a look at that. And then as we go to break, some words from Dave Strohmeyer, Commissioner Dave Strohmeyer, thanking our sponsors.
yeah, just another shout out to our highball sponsors of Jacobs and KLJ Engineering. Also, this event could not be possible and would not be happening now without a whole team of folks working behind the scenes. So a shout out to my friend and colleague, Jordan Hess, who is with us here today for all of his work, to our Missoula County communications team, Sarah Bell, Emmy Bristow, Allison Franz. How could I not thank our moderator today, Justin Engel? Thank you for your work. Our Missoula County GIS team and manager Mike Snook, Missoula Community Access Television, and Jordan. Is there anyone else you want to thank from your neck of the woods?
You know, I really want to thank Alex Karklins from the University of Montana for providing tech support for this large event. It's a little nerve-wracking to have several hundred people relying on things to go smoothly, and Alex is carrying the day there. So thanks, Alex.
Okay, looks like poll results are up. Alex has made those available on the screen. Pretty even distribution of responses across the answer items. Have a look.